Hello everyone and welcome back to Panic Peak. Let me know where you are listening from in the world by leaving a comment, and if you like the episode, please like and subscribe. Now, let's get cozy, and let's begin. Some stories are born from whispers, told by travelers who swear they've experienced the impossible. You hear them in dimly lit bars, shared by people with a little too much whiskey and too many miles on their tires. I never believed in such tales until I became one of them. Now, I'm writing this down as a warning. If you ever find yourself at the Moonlit Pines Motel, turn around. Don't go in. Keep driving, no matter how tired you are. Because once you enter, you may never leave. I'll never forget the night I checked into the Moonlit Pines Motel. It was supposed to be a quick stop on my drive to Denver, a nondescript place to catch some sleep before the long stretch of highway ahead. The neon sign buzzed faintly as I parked, its letters flickering, no vacancy, except for one room. The receptionist barely looked up from her crossword puzzle as she handed me the key to room 107. The key was heavy, attached to a brass tag that gleamed dully under the lobby's fluorescent lights. Something about the tag felt strange in my hand, like it was warmer than it should have been. I shrugged it off. Exhaustion makes everything feel a little off. The room itself was nothing special. A faded floral bedspread, a TV bolted to the wall, and a faint smell of mildew. I tossed my bag on the bed, showered, and fell asleep almost instantly. When I woke, I was parched. The vending machines were outside near the lobby, so I grabbed a few dollars and stepped out into the chilly night. The hallway was silent, the kind of silence that feels like it's holding its breath. I shook the thought away and walked quickly to the vending machine. It swallowed my dollar without protest, and I retrieved a bottle of water before heading back to my room. Except room 107 wasn't where I left it. I stood in the hallway, staring at the door where my room should have been. The numbers on the door read 203. My heart began to race. Maybe I'd turned the wrong corner. I retraced my steps, but the layout of the motel seemed different. The hallway stretched farther than it had before, and the doors I passed bore numbers that made no sense: 112, 305, 118. My breathing quickened as I reached what should have been the end of the hall, only to find another turn leading to more doors. Panic gripped me as I walked faster, calling out, "Hello? Is anyone there?" My voice echoed faintly but brought no response. I turned another corner and another, my steps faltering as exhaustion and fear set in. The numbers on the doors twisted higher and higher: 501, 726, 999. They weren't just wrong, they were impossible. I stopped at a door labeled 1313. The brass key in my hand felt heavier, almost burning. Its tag had changed, now engraved with the same number as the door before me. My hand trembled as I fit the key into the lock and turned it. The room was mine, but it wasn't. The bedspread was the same pattern, but darker, stained with something rust-colored. The TV was on, playing static at full volume. The air smelled of rot. I backed out of the room, heart hammering in my chest, and slammed the door shut. The hallway behind me had changed again. I ran, turning corners at random, desperate to find the lobby or an exit or anything familiar. Doors blurred past me, the numbers shifting like liquid. My legs ached, but I couldn't stop. Each door I tried either wouldn't open or led back to the same room, 1313. Each time, it looked worse: walls peeling, shadows crawling, the bedspread moving, as if something was writhing beneath it. Time became meaningless. My watch had stopped, the hands frozen at 3:07 a.m. The fluorescent lights buzzed erratically, sometimes flickering off completely, leaving me in near darkness. My feet ached, my throat was raw from screaming for help, and my mind raced with every horrible possibility. Once, I thought I heard footsteps behind me. Hope surged as I spun around, but the hallway was empty. No one was there. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The shadows on the walls seemed to shift when I wasn't looking, crawling closer, their edges unnaturally sharp. Eventually, I stopped running. Exhaustion made my legs feel like lead. I collapsed in front of a door marked 0000. The brass tag on my key was blank again, but I didn't care. My trembling hands pushed the key into the lock, and the door creaked open. Inside, the room was vast and empty, its walls stretching into darkness. The only source of light came from a single chair sitting in the center, illuminated by a flickering bulb dangling from the ceiling. On the chair sat a notebook, its cover blank. I approached cautiously, my footsteps echoing unnaturally loud in the cavernous space. When I opened the notebook, the pages were filled with handwriting, mine. Each entry described events I hadn't experienced yet, running down endless hallways, encountering doors with impossible numbers, the reflection in the mirror. The last entry ended mid-sentence, and then the lights went out, and the bulb above me shattered, plunging the room into darkness. I screamed, stumbling backward, the notebook clutched tightly in my hands. A low, guttural laugh echoed around me, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. I fumbled for the door, but it was gone. The walls seemed to close in, the air growing heavy and cold. Whispers filled the void, incomprehensible and overlapping, each one dripping with malice. I sank to the floor, covering my ears, but the whispers grew louder, piercing through my hands. Suddenly, a door appeared in the darkness, its frame glowing faintly. The whispers stopped as I stared at it, unsure whether to trust this new escape. The brass key in my hand burned hot, the tag now engraved with a single word, "Run." I hesitated for only a moment before bolting toward the door. It swung open before I could touch it, revealing another hallway. This one was dimly lit, its walls lined with mirrors. As I ran, my reflection stared back at me, but something was wrong. Each reflection moved slightly out of sync, smiling when I didn't, their eyes glinting with malevolent glee. The hallway stretched endlessly, the mirrors multiplying until I was surrounded. I stopped, breathing hard, and turned to face one of them. My reflection stepped forward, grinning wickedly. It reached toward the glass, its hand breaking through with a shattering sound. I turned to run, but the reflections were everywhere, clawing their way out of the mirrors. Their laughter filled the air as they closed in. I screamed, falling to the ground, the brass key slipping from my hand and skittering across the floor. When I opened my eyes, I was back in room 1313. The bedspread was pristine, the TV silent. The air smelled faintly of mildew again, as if nothing had happened. But the brass tag on the key had changed once more. It now bore a number I hadn't seen before, 0001. And the whispers were still there, just beneath the silence, waiting. I don't know how long I've been trapped here. Days? Weeks? The brass tag changes every time I wake up. Sometimes it reads 0002 or 1314, other times a number so high it's meaningless. But it always brings me back to this same room, this same cycle. I've tried everything, breaking windows, tearing at the walls, screaming into the void, but the motel doesn't let me go. It's alive, feeding on my fear, my despair. I've come to understand that the numbers aren't random, they're counting something. Measuring something. And when they reach the end, so will I. So, to whoever finds this, if anyone ever does, please heed my warning. The Moonlit Pines Motel isn't a place to rest, it's a trap. If you're reading this, it means the motel has chosen you as its next victim. The brass tag now reads $99.99. I can hear footsteps outside the door. The air was thick with the promise of something wrong as I turned onto the dirt road leading to the motel. It was a place I'd driven past countless times, but tonight, it felt different. The dim glow of the neon sign flickered in the distance, its cracked letters inviting me into the silence. I hadn't planned to stay here, not really, but after hours of driving through endless woods, the need for rest overtook my better judgment. As the headlights of my car faded, swallowed by the vast emptiness around me, I felt a coldness seep in. A feeling that this place wasn't just a stopover, but a destination. For reasons I couldn't explain, I knew the motel was waiting for me. The first thing I noticed about the motel was its stillness. A heavy, unnatural silence wrapped around the building, muffling the crunch of gravel under my boots as I walked to my room. The neon sign outside blinked sporadically, its red letters casting eerie shadows that seemed to writhe on the cracked pavement. Room 7, the key felt oddly warm in my hand, like it had been waiting for me to take it. The door creaked as I pushed it open. Inside, the air smelled faintly of mildew and something sweet, like overripe fruit. The single window was smeared with fingerprints, and the pale yellow wallpaper peeled at the edges, revealing faint scribbles beneath. I dropped my bag onto the bed, the springs groaning in protest, and went to draw the curtains. That's when I saw it, the notebook. It sat on the rickety nightstand, its leather cover cracked with age. My name was scrawled across the front in looping, unfamiliar handwriting. I froze. For a moment, I debated leaving right then and there, but curiosity, or something deeper, darker, urged me forward. I picked it up, the pages falling open as though the book had been waiting for me. The first entry was innocuous enough, details of my childhood I'd almost forgotten myself. The backyard oak tree I used to climb, the scar on my knee from a bike accident. But as I turned the pages, the entries became unsettlingly precise. It chronicled my teenage years, my first love, the time I stole a candy bar from a convenience store and never told anyone. Each page was filled with moments I'd never shared, not even with those closest to me. I felt a chill creep up my spine as I flipped to the latest entry. The ink was fresh, the lines sharper than the rest. Tonight, we meet. The words stared back at me, their finality pressing down on my chest. My hands trembled as I closed the notebook and shoved it under the bed, as though hiding it could erase the dread coiling in my stomach. I told myself it was a prank, some elaborate joke. But who would go to such lengths? And why? The room seemed darker now, the dim bulb overhead flickering. I glanced at the door to make sure it was locked, the chain secure. The silence deepened, pressing against my eardrums. I turned on the TV, hoping to drown out the quiet, but the screen only showed static. I wondered if I had simply imagined the whole thing, the book, the handwriting, the strange familiarity. Maybe I was tired, too exhausted from the road. Then came the knock. 3 sharp raps echoed through the room, impossibly loud. My breath hitched. Slowly, I approached the door, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Who's there?" I called, my voice barely above a whisper. No response. Another knock, more insistent this time. My fingers hovered over the chain, but I couldn't bring myself to unlock it. Instead, I pressed my eye to the peephole. The hallway was empty. A cold draft swept through the room, and the curtains billowed despite the window being shut. I turned back to the bed, and froze. The notebook was there again, resting on the pillow. I hadn't put it there. The cover was open, revealing a new entry. You shouldn't have looked. My blood ran cold. The air felt thick, like I was breathing through a wet cloth. I stumbled back, my knees hitting the nightstand. The lamp toppled, plunging the room into darkness. That's when I heard it, the sound of breathing, slow and steady, coming from the corner of the room. My chest tightened as I fumbled for my phone, its weak flashlight barely piercing the gloom. The beam landed on the corner, illuminating a figure. Pale, impossibly thin, its head cocked unnaturally to the side. Eyes, dark and glistening, watched me with an intensity that made my stomach churn. Its lips curled into a smile, revealing teeth too sharp, too many. "You're late," it whispered, its voice raspy and wet, like leaves dragged across concrete. The phone slipped from my hand, the light vanishing as it hit the floor. In the suffocating darkness, the figure moved closer, its steps deliberate and soundless. I felt the mattress dip behind me, the faint scent of decay filling my nostrils. "Why me?" I managed to choke out, my voice trembling. Its breath was hot against my ear. "Because you forgot." I didn't have time to scream. The figure had been gone by the time I woke up. The first rays of dawn filtered through the blinds, bathing the room in a pale, unnatural light. My clothes were damp with sweat, and my heart raced as I looked around the room. The bed was empty, the door still locked. The notebook was gone. I thought it was over, perhaps a nightmare, a product of fatigue and isolation. But as I packed my things and made my way to the car, something caught my eye, a small scrap of paper crumpled on the passenger seat. Hesitant, I unfolded it. "You're not leaving." The words were typed, no ink smudges, no sign of age. Just the same precise lettering. I felt the stillness again, the oppressive weight of the air around me. The silence had returned. And this time, it wasn't going anywhere. I should have left right then. But the draw to stay, to understand, kept me bound to the motel, as if some invisible thread tethered me to that room. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever force had been toying with me had no intention of letting me go. A part of me wanted to fight back, to break free, but my feet remained heavy on the ground, and my mind clouded with dread. Weeks passed. Days bled into one another with no sense of time. I couldn't leave, not entirely. Every time I tried to drive away, the road twisted back in on itself, leading me back to the motel. The gravel path that once seemed so foreign was now a part of my routine. I knew every crack in the pavement, every flicker of the neon sign. Every time I entered my room, room 7, the sense of familiarity grew. I had returned for a reason, though I couldn't quite put it into words. Every moment in that place felt like a dream, or maybe a nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. The notebook would appear without fail, sometimes by the bed, other times on the bathroom sink. Each time, a new entry, a new memory, a new revelation. Each page seemed to grow darker. My past unfolded with a chilling precision that made me question everything I thought I knew about myself. One night, the entry was different. It wasn't written in ink. It was carved into the page. "You are the one who called us." The words burned themselves into my mind as I read them, the chilling realization sinking in. I hadn't stumbled upon this motel by accident. It had been waiting for me. It had called me here. And as I stared at the page, I understood that I had never been alone. The figure had been there before. It would be back again. But now, I was a part of it. And there was no escaping what I had become. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I wasn't just trapped in this motel. I was becoming a part of it. The walls, the air, the very ground beneath my feet, it all belonged to something darker than I could comprehend. Every night, the figure would return, its form becoming more defined, more real with each passing encounter. But it wasn't just watching me anymore. It was waiting for me to join it, to surrender to the silence, the stillness, the endless loop. I spent days in a daze, no longer sure where the motel ended and I began. The motel felt like an extension of my body now. My mind, too. I thought of the road, how it led back to the same place no matter how many times I tried to leave. I thought of the notebook, its entries, how they had begun to mirror the things I couldn't escape, the things I feared. I had stopped wondering if it was a dream. I had stopped wondering if I could leave. I knew, deep down, I never would. And one night, the knock came again. 3 sharp raps that cut through the silence like a blade. This time, I didn't hesitate. I didn't even think. I opened the door. The figure stood there, its pale, gaunt form taller than I remembered. It smiled, revealing those same sharp, too many teeth. But this time, its eyes weren't just dark, they were hollow, empty. "You're finally here," it whispered, its voice the sound of 1,000 whispers at once. "It's time." I stepped into the darkness without a word. The motel had claimed me, and there was no longer any need to fight. The door slammed shut behind me. I thought I was safe. After months of running, of hearing footsteps that never seemed to belong to anyone, of feeling eyes on my back wherever I went, I thought that booking a room at a remote, little-known motel would finally give me a moment to breathe. A place where no one would find me. No one would know me. No one would come for me. I had been wrong before. When I arrived at the motel, the world around me felt like it was trapped in time, frozen between night and day. The old building loomed in the distance, tucked away among thick woods, its flickering neon sign the only indication that anyone even remembered it existed. I should have felt a sense of relief, but there was a heaviness in the air that I couldn't shake. Still, I was determined to stay. I had to. My legs were tired, my mind worn down by the constant fear of being followed. This was my last stop, I swore to myself. I could rest here. Just for a night. But it didn't take long for me to realize that the peace I'd hoped for was a lie. The knocking started as soon as I locked the door behind me. Knocking that shouldn't have been there. I had barely thrown my bag onto the bed before I heard it, the soft, almost tentative knock. It echoed through the empty room like a whisper, too faint to be real. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. I told myself it was nothing, a trick of the wind, a creak from the old building. I had been on edge for so long. The thought of him following me, he was still out there, wasn't he, kept me on constant alert. I walked cautiously toward the door, peering through the peephole. Nothing. The hallway outside was empty, shrouded in darkness. I let out a shaky breath, trying to calm my nerves. It must have been a mistake. A figment of my imagination. I locked the door again and turned away, determined to shake off the unease that clung to me. But just as I was about to sit down on the bed, the knock came again. This time, louder. Knock. 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 3 sharp raps that made my blood run cold. My heart skipped a beat. I pressed my ear to the door, straining to hear anything on the other side. Nothing. I slowly turned the door handle, my fingers trembling, but stopped myself just before I opened it. What if it was him? What if someone had found me? I took a step back, thinking quickly. I should call the front desk, check if anyone else was staying here, but the thought of getting near that phone, of hearing someone's voice in this silence, terrified me. What if it was him on the other side of the line, playing some cruel game? What if I was never alone here, not for a single moment? I picked up my phone and dialed the front desk. The line rang for what seemed like an eternity. Just as I was about to hang up, the elderly woman's voice crackled through. "Yes, dear," she said, her tone calm, soothing almost. "Someone's knocking on my door," I said, my voice quivering. "I thought you said I was the only guest." There was a long pause. Then, in a low voice, she replied, "You are, dear. The roads are quiet tonight. No one's coming. Are you sure it's not the wind? The old building creaks sometimes." "No," I said quickly, my words tumbling out. "It's not the wind. It's someone knocking. It's happening every hour. Please, check." Her voice dropped even lower, the words nearly a whisper. "Don't open the door, dear. Stay inside your room. I'll be right there." Before I could ask another question, the line went dead. The phone in my hand seemed to buzz with a strange static, and I could feel my heart sinking. I stood there, staring at the phone, frozen. "Don't open the door." The woman's voice was eerie, but it was her words that unsettled me the most. Why was she so calm? Why had she known I was on edge? And why had she said stay inside? Was I being watched? Had someone been waiting for me to show up? A soft, tentative knock on the door broke my thoughts, but this time it wasn't like before. It was louder, insistent. The knocking came in quick succession, bang. 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 3 knocks, just as before. I held my breath. Should I call the police? Should I leave? The thought of stepping out into the cold night made my stomach churn. I slowly turned the lock and crept toward the door, my hand trembling as I reached for the knob. The moment I touched it, the knocking stopped. There was a silence so thick, it was suffocating. I waited, barely breathing, but no further sound came. I pulled my hand back and stepped away from the door, my mind a swirl of conflicting thoughts. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know if I should run or stay put, but I couldn't shake the feeling that leaving now would be the worst decision I could make. Another hour passed, and I thought maybe, just maybe, it was over. I lay in the bed, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind howl outside. The minutes dragged on, but just as I thought I might finally get some rest, it came again. Knock. 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 It was unmistakable. There was no mistaking it now. Someone was at the door. I scrambled to my feet, my hands clutching the edge of the bed as I fought to calm my breathing. Asterisk stay calm. Stay inside. Don't open the door, asterisk. I quickly dialed the front desk again. The phone rang and rang. No answer. What was going on? Why wasn't she answering? Had she abandoned me? I looked toward the window, and that's when I saw it, a shadow moving across the parking lot, just outside the dim light from the flickering sign. I squinted, heart racing. The figure seemed to be moving slowly, deliberately, toward the motel. It was him. I was sure of it. I grabbed my phone again, trying to dial the police, but the signal was weak, barely a whisper of connection. I could feel the terror rising in my chest. Was he already inside? Then, without warning, the door handle turned. I froze, every muscle in my body locking in place. The door creaked, just a little, as if it were about to open. But I couldn't let it happen. I wouldn't let it happen. In a panic, I ran to the window and threw the curtains aside. There was nothing but blackness beyond the glass. I turned back to the door, praying that whatever it was, whatever was out there, would just leave. But then, a voice, low and guttural, whispered through the crack under the door. "I'm here." I stumbled backward, my chest heaving. It was him. It was the voice I'd been dreading for so long. And then the knocking started again. Bang. 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 The door shook with each knock, and I realized, with a horrifying clarity, that I wasn't alone. The door rattled harder. The lock was barely holding, and in that moment, I knew I wouldn't make it through the night. I ran for the door, my fingers fumbling to unlock it, to find some way out. But as I reached for the handle, I heard the voice again. Closer this time, just behind me. "I told you, I'd find you." A scream tore from my throat as I turned to face him. But when I looked back toward the door, I saw only darkness. The last thing I heard before the world went black was the sound of faint knocking. I woke up in the same bed, but everything was wrong. The room looked the same, old, dimly lit, but there was something suffocating about the air. I sat up quickly, my breath catching in my throat. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. Panic surged through me. I turned toward the door, but the knocking began again, soft at first, like a whisper, then growing louder. It wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from the other side of the room. I knew, with terrible certainty, that I had never been alone here. That no matter how far I ran, I would never escape the midnight visitor. The knocking was just the beginning. The rain had been relentless, slashing against the windshield as we drove down that lonely stretch of highway. It was one of those late-night drives where the world outside felt like it was slipping away into some endless void, the road seeming to stretch on forever. We had been on the road for hours, the sky darkened by clouds so thick it felt like the night would never end. Both of us were weary, desperate for any sign of civilization, any sign of relief. That's when we saw the motel. It wasn't much to look at, a run-down, desolate place wedged between a gas station and a rusting diner that had probably closed a decade ago. Its flickering neon sign, reading "vacancy," seemed to pulse like a distant heartbeat, offering us a momentary sense of hope. We weren't picky. We just needed to sleep. We pulled into the parking lot, the gravel crunching beneath the tires as we parked near the front door. There was no one around, just the sound of the rain and the occasional flash of lightning. Chris turned to me, his voice tired but relieved. "Let's just get a room and crash for the night. We'll figure the rest out tomorrow." I nodded, grateful that we had found somewhere to rest. But little did I know, this desolate motel would soon become a place I would never forget, a place where the line between reality and nightmare would blur in the most unimaginable way. The bell above the motel door chimed as we stepped inside. The air was thick with the musty scent of old wood and dust, and the dim light from a flickering bulb cast long shadows across the cracked linoleum floor. Behind the counter stood a man whose presence seemed to suck the warmth from the room. He was thin, his skin a pale yellow hue, and his eyes gleamed with a strange, unsettling brightness. "Welcome," he rasped, his voice like gravel being ground underfoot. "Room for two." Chris nodded and handed over the cash. "It's been a long day." The clerk took the money without a word, his bony fingers brushing against Chris's as he handed over the key. It was an old-fashioned brass key, the number 6 scratched across the top with a dull penknife. "Room 6, the clerk said, his lips curling into a strange, unsettling smile. You'll find it down the hall. I felt a shiver crawl up my spine as we walked down the hallway toward the room. The place was eerily silent, and the air seemed thick, heavy, as if it was holding its breath. The walls were cracked, the carpet stained, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone in this place. The storm outside continued to rage, the occasional clap of thunder shaking the walls. We reached room 6 and opened the door. The moment I stepped inside, I froze. It wasn't the room itself, it was the photographs. The walls were covered in them, framed in dusty, cracked wood. Old black and white pictures, faded color shots, some in sepia tones, each one carefully placed, each one showing a different scene. But what unsettled me wasn't the subject matter of the photos, it was the strange, subtle detail that only became clear once I looked closely. Every single photo had only one person in it. I stepped closer to one, my heart beating faster as I studied the image of a family standing together in front of a large house. The mother and father, both dressed in old-fashioned clothing, were smiling at the camera. But there was no child. Just the two of them, grinning as if everything was normal, as if their world wasn't missing a piece. I pulled away, confused, and looked at the next photo, a couple in a field. Just the man, smiling at the camera, the woman nowhere to be seen. I turned to Chris, my voice trembling. "Do you see this?" He had been rummaging through the dresser, but now he stopped and walked over to where I stood, staring at the wall. He seemed to notice what I was pointing at, but he only frowned. "What about it?" I pointed to another photo, a couple at the beach. The woman was in a flowing dress, her hair blowing in the wind, but there was no man beside her. I felt a chill crawl up my spine as I glanced around the room. Every wall was covered in photographs, photos of people, but always just one person. Chris stepped closer, eyes narrowing. "That's weird. It's just you in all of them, right?" I shook my head, my pulse quickening. "No, that's not right. It's not just me. It's not anyone I recognize." Chris gave me a strange look, but then he seemed to forget about the photos, turning to unpack. I was still staring at the wall when I caught something else in the corner of my eye. The picture on the nightstand. It wasn't there before. I approached it carefully. It was a photo of a man in front of an old car. He was dressed in a weather jacket and a cap, his face smiling faintly as if caught off guard. My blood ran cold as I leaned closer. That was Chris. But, no, it couldn't be. The man in the picture didn't look exactly like him. He looked older, different, as though this photo had been taken decades ago. But there was no mistaking the eyes, the same dark eyes, the same crooked smile. "Chris," I whispered, turning to him. "Look at this." Chris looked up from his suitcase, then walked over to where I stood, his expression shifting when he saw the photo. He stared at it, his brow furrowing, confusion clouding his face. That's me," he said, voice thick with disbelief. But it wasn't. The longer I stared, the more wrong it felt. There was something off about him, something hidden behind his eyes. "No," I said, my voice trembling. "That's not you. That's not you." Chris took a step back, shaking his head, his eyes unfocused as he looked at the photo. "It looks like me, though, but why is it so old?" I swallowed, my throat dry. "We need to leave. This place is wrong, Chris. There's something wrong with it." But as I turned toward the door, I froze. The hallway outside was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the motel's flickering sign. I heard something, slow, deliberate footsteps. The sound echoed through the empty hallway. I turned to Chris, but he was no longer looking at the photo. His gaze was fixed on something else, on the wall across from us, where a new picture had appeared. This time, it was a photo of him, standing in front of the same car, smiling just like the one on the nightstand. Except, this time, I wasn't in it. "Chris, what's happening?" My voice barely made it out, my throat tight, my vision blurring. Chris didn't respond. His gaze was distant, unblinking. "Who are you?" he whispered. His voice cracked, as though he couldn't recognize me anymore. The wall seemed to close in around us. My heart was pounding as I rushed toward the door, but it wouldn't budge. Panic clawed at my chest. "Chris, we need to leave, now." I turned back to him, but he was frozen, staring at the wall with those empty, unseeing eyes. I backed away, trembling, my skin crawling with the knowledge that something had changed. Something terrible had taken place. Then, I heard it. A voice. Soft, like a whisper from across the room, but it came from nowhere. "Vacancy, 4-1. The room spun, and I felt the ground shift beneath my feet. I looked at Chris once more, and a wave of horror washed over me. He was gone. There was no trace of him. Just the photos, always just the photos. And I realized, with a sinking feeling, that there had always been vacancy for one. And that one was me. I stumbled back, my breath coming in short, frantic gasps. My heart hammered in my chest as the weight of what was happening began to settle in. The room felt suffocating, the walls closing in around me, the air thick with something oppressive. I could hear my own pulse in my ears, deafening and disorienting, drowning out everything else. I looked at the photos again, my gaze flicking from one to the next, each one a twisted reminder of the truth I had yet to fully grasp. In every frame, Chris was there, and I was nowhere. I turned around, hoping for an escape, but there was nothing. The door was still locked, the room still silent except for my frantic breathing and the sound of my thoughts swirling out of control. I reached for the door again, pulling on the handle with all my strength, but it wouldn't budge. The air seemed to grow heavier with each passing second, the silence more suffocating. My pulse was deafening now, my hands shaking, my mind racing. How had it come to this? Where had Chris gone? Had he ever really been there at all? The voice echoed again, this time clearer, sharper. "Vacancy, 4-1. It felt like the very walls were speaking to me, as if the building itself had been waiting for this moment, waiting for me. A cold wave of dread washed over me, and I suddenly understood. The photos, the room, the strange, unnatural silence, it was all part of the same twisted puzzle. I turned, desperate to find a way out, but the room felt smaller now, the ceiling closing in. The photo on the nightstand was different now, too. It was no longer the picture of Chris. Now, it was of me. My face stared back at me, frozen in a smile that wasn't mine. The eyes were hollow, empty, and I felt the horror of it seep into my very bones. The room wasn't just trapping me, it was changing me. It had already taken Chris, and now, it was taking me. The thought sent a wave of panic surging through me. I backed away from the photo, my feet stumbling over the floor, but the room kept shifting. The walls seemed to warp, the corners growing darker, the air thick with the weight of something ancient, something that had been waiting for this moment. I reached out again for the door, but this time, it swung open on its own, as if it had been waiting for me to finally surrender. I didn't think. I just ran. I dashed down the hallway, my footsteps echoing against the cracked walls, the flickering lights casting long, distorted shadows. I didn't care if the road outside was still flooded or if there was nowhere to go. I just needed to escape. To get away from that place, from whatever force had claimed it. I burst through the front door of the motel, and the storm hit me like a slap to the face, cold and biting. But as I stumbled into the rain, my feet sinking into the mud, I turned back one last time to look at the motel. And there it was, standing silent and unchanged, the flickering vacancy sign casting its dull, inviting glow. And in the window, behind the glass, I saw something I could never forget. There was Chris. Standing there, smiling at me, just like the man in the photo. But he wasn't Chris anymore. He was something else. Something hollow. The voice whispered again, this time louder, clearer. Vacancy, 4-1. And then, in that moment, I understood. I was the vacancy. And now, I was the one who would never leave. It was one of those nights when the road seemed to stretch on endlessly, the miles becoming a blur beneath the tires, and my eyelids heavy from exhaustion. The endless stretch of highway had begun to play tricks on me, and I could feel the weight of the night pressing in on my shoulders. The silence of the car, broken only by the low hum of the engine, was starting to suffocate me. My stomach growled, but food felt like a distant thought. I needed rest, and I needed it soon. I had been driving for what felt like an eternity when I saw it, a faint neon sign flickering in the distance, casting an eerie greenish glow in the otherwise empty landscape. A roadside motel, offering rest for the weary traveler. The kind of place you don't ask too many questions about. I was too tired to care. I just needed to sleep. I pulled into the parking lot, the gravel crunching beneath my tires as I stopped in front of the lobby. The building was low, old, and worn, with a few flickering lights spilling out from the windows. The kind of place you'd expect to find on a desolate stretch of road, far from any town. The doors opened with a loud creak as I stepped inside. The lobby was dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of stale coffee, old books, and something else I couldn't quite place. A dusty fan spun slowly overhead, moving the still air lazily around the room. The furniture was mismatched, and the wallpaper, peeling in places, hinted at a time when this place might have been somewhat lively. Behind the counter stood the manager, an elderly man with a gaunt face and unsettlingly still eyes. His clothes were old-fashioned, like he had stepped out of another era, dark trousers, a crisp white shirt with the sleeves rolled up, and an old wool vest. He didn't smile, just watched me with an intense, steady gaze that made my skin prickle. "You need a room?" he asked, his voice a low rasp, smooth but carrying an undertone of something deeper, something I couldn't quite place. I nodded, still half-dazed from the drive. My eyes wandered over the cluttered desk, the vintage key hooks, the faded brochure that promised comfort and quiet at the motel. "Room 12, he said, handing me a key with a cold, metallic tag. "It's the only one left. It's a little out of the way." I glanced at the key and noticed that the number 12 had been scratched in unevenly, as if it had been hastily marked. "Thank you," I said, eager to get to my room, but something about the man's gaze held me there for a moment longer. He seemed to be studying me, his eyes piercing in a way that made me uncomfortable. "Just one thing," he said, his voice lowering to a near whisper, "you'll want to leave before midnight. It's important that you don't stay past then." I blinked, unsure if I had heard him correctly. "What?" He leaned forward, as if he was sharing a secret. "Don't stay past midnight. The rooms, they change after that. You won't be able to leave." I chuckled, more out of nervousness than disbelief. It seemed like some kind of local superstition or just the ramblings of an old man. Still, I couldn't shake the chill that crawled up my spine. "Thanks for the heads up," I said with a smile, though it felt forced. I took the key from his hand, the cold metal sending an involuntary shiver through me, and walked out of the lobby. The hallways were eerily quiet, the only sound being my footsteps echoing off the walls. The carpet beneath my feet was worn, threadbare in places. I reached room 12 and hesitated before inserting the key. The door creaked open, revealing a small, sparsely furnished room. The bed was covered in a faded quilt, the furniture old and mismatched. The curtains were drawn, blocking any view of the outside world. I shook off the unease and set my things down. I had been on the road for far too long and just needed to rest. I turned on the lamp, the soft yellow light offering little comfort, and collapsed onto the bed, allowing my tired muscles to relax. But as I lay there, trying to silence the creeping discomfort, something felt wrong. The air was still, too still. There was a heaviness in the room, a sense of something watching. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I glanced at the clock. It was 11:30 p.m. I lay still for a while, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. The silence in the room pressed in around me, suffocating. Every minute felt like an hour, the ticking of the clock now the loudest thing in the room. I tried to ignore the gnawing unease, but the manager's words kept echoing in my head, "Don't stay past midnight." I stood up, pacing the room, my thoughts tangled. Maybe I was just tired, maybe it was the isolation playing tricks on my mind. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting, something was about to happen. At exactly midnight, the room felt different. The clock struck 12, and the air in the room seemed to shift. A cold draft swept through the cracks in the window, and I felt it, a sudden, almost imperceptible change. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I turned toward the door. The silence was broken only by the low hum of the old air conditioning unit, which had just kicked on. I walked toward the door, feeling the sudden need to leave, but as I reached for the handle, I froze. The door was locked, I yanked the handle, pulling with all my strength, but it wouldn't budge. A feeling of dread washed over me as I pulled harder, trying to force it open. My pulse quickened. I stepped back, heart racing, as I realized that the key in my pocket didn't seem to work either. The door to the outside world had sealed itself. A quiet, oppressive silence filled the room. I turned to look at the bed, the walls, the window. Everything seemed subtly wrong. The wallpaper, once slightly faded, now seemed to be peeling away in strange patterns, like something was clawing at it from the other side. The bed had shifted slightly, the blanket now askew, as if someone had been lying there just moments before. Panic surged through me. No, I thought, this isn't real, but when I rushed to the window, I couldn't even see outside. Just a reflection of my own wide-eyed face staring back at me in the glass. There was no sign of the outside world, no lights from the street, no cars in the parking lot. Just an endless expanse of black. I backed away from the window, my mind racing. What was happening? The manager's warning echoed in my mind, louder now, as if the room itself was absorbing his words. The rooms, they change after midnight. You won't be able to leave. I ran to the back door, tried it with desperation, but it was locked too. I tried the window in the bathroom, but it was sealed shut, the frame welded in place. No. No, 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 I pounded on the walls, the door, screamed for help, but there was no answer. My voice was swallowed up by the suffocating silence. I was trapped. Frantically, I searched the room for any other way out, but it was no use. The room felt smaller, tighter, like the walls were closing in. Every time I thought I was close to escaping, I found myself back where I started. Then I heard it, the footsteps. Soft, deliberate, coming from the hallway outside. Someone, or something, was walking toward my room. I froze, every muscle in my body tense. I pressed my ear to the door, straining to hear, but the steps grew louder. Closer. And then, just as I was about to bolt for the window again, the door handle rattled. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps stopped, but the handle kept turning, a soft clicking sound that made my blood run cold. "Get out, before it's too late." The manager's voice. But distant, muffled. As though it were coming from far down the hallway, or from somewhere deeper. I pressed my ear to the door again. Silence. And then, a whisper, just above a breath. "You're already too late." The clock struck 12:30 a.m. The air in the room grew impossibly thick, suffocating. I could barely breathe, as if the very walls were drawing in, squeezing the life out of the space. The clock, with its relentless ticking, was the only sound left, tick, 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 each second dragging me deeper into despair. The door handle rattled again, this time louder, more frantic. Someone, or something, was on the other side, desperately trying to get in. My hands shook as I backed away from the door, but there was nowhere to hide. The room felt like it was closing in on me, the shadows creeping ever closer, swallowing every corner. I turned toward the window, a last-ditch effort, but as I reached for the blinds, I saw it, my reflection, staring back at me in the glass, eyes wide with fear. But it wasn't just me. There was something behind me, in the reflection, standing just out of reach, an outline of a figure, blurry at first, then becoming clearer with every passing second. A figure in the corner of the room. I spun around, my heart in my throat, but there was nothing there. Just the same empty room. But the reflection in the window, it moved. The figure in the glass was still there, its shadow now stretching toward me. I backed away, my breath catching in my throat. "It's just the reflection," I told myself. Asterisk, it's just your mind playing tricks. You're tired, asterisk. But then the figure in the window smiled. The chill that ran through me wasn't just cold, it was deadly. A fear so deep, so primal, that I froze where I stood. I tried to scream, but my throat was tight, constricted, as though I had swallowed a lump of ice. I reached for the door again, my fingers trembling, but as I touched the handle, I felt it. The coldness. The unnatural, freezing coldness seeping through the wood, as if the door had turned into ice. I stepped back, horrified. Then the walls, they began to shift. The wallpaper peeled away in long strips, revealing a dark, decaying underlayer, the paint beneath it chipped and cracked, revealing something worse. Beneath the facade of a motel room, I saw the true nature of this place. The edges of the room started to blur, the walls warping, bending unnaturally. The furniture, once solid and familiar, became distorted, stretching in impossible directions, as though reality itself was being torn apart. It wasn't just the room that was changing. It was me. The reflection in the window wasn't me anymore. It was something else. Something dark. Something that wasn't supposed to exist. The clock's ticking became deafening. I couldn't tell if the time was still moving or if the world around me had just stopped. But I knew one thing, I was no longer in control. The footsteps outside had returned, but now they weren't walking. They were dragging. A slow, deliberate scraping noise that came closer and closer, until I felt the presence on the other side of the door, something close, something waiting. I didn't dare open it. The whispering began again. "You should have listened," it said, the voice almost a hiss. Now, you'll never leave. My pulse raced as I turned back to the room. I searched for some escape, something that could help me, but it was too late. The door wouldn't open. The walls wouldn't let me leave. The reflection, no longer my own, reached out from the glass, its fingers brushing against the surface, as though it wanted to pull me in. I turned to face the manager's warning one last time. But there was no escape. Time itself had betrayed me. And in that moment, I understood. The room didn't just change after midnight. It claimed you. I was trapped. I would always be trapped. Forever. I had always prided myself on being able to sense when something was wrong, when danger was close. But nothing could have prepared me for the terror I was about to face. It started with a whisper of footsteps, the sense that someone was always behind me, watching, waiting. I would glance over my shoulder, only to find empty streets or quiet corners. At first, I thought it was paranoia. Just my mind playing tricks. But that was before I started seeing his eyes. Cold. Hollow. Unblinking. Following me, no matter where I went. I tried to shake him. I moved cities, changed my routine, even took different routes just to throw him off. But the eyes remained. And soon, I couldn't escape the feeling that he was everywhere. When I rented that cheap motel room on the outskirts of town, I thought I'd finally found a place to hide. I should have known better. Now, trapped in that dimly lit room, I was about to learn just how wrong I was. I could feel my breath heavy in my chest, the echo of my footsteps ringing through the motel hallway as I ran. The neon sign outside flickered, casting unsettling shadows across the cracked pavement. My hands trembled, and my mind raced in frantic spirals, but I knew, if I didn't make it inside that room, I wouldn't make it out of here at all. I slammed the door shut behind me, my back against it as I locked it with a hurried twist. It wasn't much, this shabby room, with its faded carpet and peeling wallpaper. But it was a refuge, or so I thought. A brief moment of safety from the relentless man who had been following me for days, weeks. His eyes, those eyes. Cold, empty, never leaving me. I needed to breathe. I turned and stumbled into the room, the darkness settling around me like a heavy cloak. The small lamp by the bed barely illuminated the corner where the shadows played tricks on my mind. I had to gather my thoughts. I needed a plan. Maybe I could. A soft creaking sound. It froze me in place. My heart skipped a beat. I wasn't alone. I turned my gaze upward, my eyes skimming the room in search of the source. It was then I saw it, just above the bed. A small, circular hole in the ceiling. No, not just a hole. An eye-shaped peephole. But it wasn't static. It moved, ever so slightly, following my every movement as I stood there, frozen. My breath hitched. I stepped closer, my hand reaching toward the ceiling, but my feet felt heavy. The hole, the eye, it seemed to track me. I froze again. It was watching me. And the longer I stared at it, the more certain I became. It wasn't just a hole. A wave of nausea washed over me as the eye grew larger. I could almost make out the pupil, dark and black as ink, narrowing as if it were studying me. The skin around it seemed to stretch unnaturally, as though it wasn't just a hole at all but something alive. A thing that was inside the ceiling. Something that had been watching me for far longer than I realized. I backed away slowly, my mind racing. This can't be happening, but as I moved, so did the eye, shifting ever so slightly to keep me in view. I tried to scream, but my throat was dry. The room seemed to shrink, the walls closing in around me. My breath came out in shallow gasps as panic set in. I needed to escape. But there was nowhere to go. No way to hide. Not from this. With trembling hands, I fumbled for my phone, hoping against hope that I could call for help. But before I could unlock it, a sound filled the room, soft at first, then louder, a tapping, as though something from above was scratching against the ceiling, trying to break through. It wasn't just an eye anymore. It was a presence. A thing that knew I was here. And it was closing in. The tapping grew louder, more frantic, until it was like nails scraping against wood. My hands shook violently as I gripped the phone, but there was no signal, no one could help me. I had to face this alone. I staggered backward, eyes never leaving the ceiling, the eye now so large it seemed to consume the space above me. Its pupil shifted, rolling downward, and for a moment, I thought I saw it, something. Behind the eye, a dark shadow moving with it, like a shape that was just out of reach. I backed toward the bed, my legs trembling, but the movement of the eye followed me. The thing above me was no longer just a presence. It was a hunger. I could feel it, pressing against my skin, suffocating the air around me. Then came the cracking sound, sharp and deafening. My eyes flew to the ceiling. I didn't know how long I had been staring at it before the crack appeared, jagged and violent, splitting across the plaster. The eye blinked, as if surprised by the sudden rupture, but it quickly resumed its gaze. I stumbled backward, panic bubbling in my throat, but the ground seemed to tilt beneath me. The bed was now directly beneath the eye. And it was lowering itself. I could hear the ceiling groan as the hole stretched wider, like something was pushing through. It wasn't just an eye anymore. The skin around it peeled away, and the thing behind it began to take form, too fast, too unnatural. A writhing mass of darkness, tendrils stretching, reaching, pulling itself closer, descending from the hole like a predator hungry for its prey. I pressed my back against the wall, desperately trying to find a way out, but the door, the only exit, was behind me. The eye, now no longer concealed by the ceiling, glared down at me from its grotesque form, its pupil narrowing to a pinpoint, like it was savoring my fear. I tried to scream. To move. But my body felt frozen. The thing above me was relentless, suffocating. Then it spoke. Its voice wasn't a sound. It wasn't a whisper. It was a feeling that burrowed into my mind, so invasive I couldn't escape it. I've been watching you, waiting, just like you knew. I wanted to scream. I wanted to fight. But my limbs were paralyzed, my voice trapped inside my chest. It moved then, impossibly fast, its tendrils stretching toward me, lashing out like hungry claws. One wrapped around my ankle, dragging me toward the bed. I clawed at the floor, trying to hold on, but it was useless. The thing above me was relentless, suffocating. I felt the cold tendril tighten around my throat, lifting me off the ground. My vision blurred, panic flooding my system as I struggled for breath. I was so close to the thing now, I could almost see its face, but it was no face at all. Just an endless void, blacker than the shadows, filled with 1,000 eyes all staring back at me, all seeing everything I had ever done. I was nothing more than a prize to it. Something to be consumed. I thought I heard the crack of the door behind me, a final chance at escape. But the room had changed. The air had thickened. There was no more hope. Only the dark. It was no longer just an eye. It was everything. I was never alone. The eye had been watching me all along. There was no escape. The room I had locked myself into had become a prison of endless eyes. The darkness, alive and hungry, closed in on me, swallowing every last ounce of resistance. As the tendrils pulled tighter, as the void above me loomed larger, I realized, too late, that I had always been its prey. I don't know if I ever truly existed in this place. Maybe I was never meant to. The darkness has a way of erasing things, of making them part of itself, and now I understand. I understand that I was never alone. I was never meant to be. And as the last breath left my body, as the eyes took me, I realized with terror that I would never leave. I had become part of it. The darkness would always be watching, waiting, consuming. There is no escape. Not from the eyes in the dark. It started like any other night of running. My hands were shaking, the adrenaline pumping through my veins as I raced down unfamiliar streets, my mind clouded with panic. I had been careful, too careful, some might say. But I couldn't afford mistakes. The cops were hot on my trail, closing in on me every minute. I needed to disappear. I needed to find somewhere, anywhere, to hide. That's when I saw the flickering neon sign of a rundown motel in the distance. Vacancy. I didn't have a choice. I pushed through the door, desperate to find refuge for just a few hours, maybe longer if I was lucky. The clerk barely looked up when I paid for the room, handing me a key without a word. I didn't care. All that mattered was the room. The walls. A bed. A chance to breathe without looking over my shoulder. But when I opened the door, I wasn't alone. I froze in the doorway, my heart hammering in my chest as I scanned the dimly lit room. The man sitting on the bed looked up slowly, his expression unreadable, his eyes locking with mine. I didn't know him, but something about him felt wrong. Like he had been waiting for me. "Didn't think I'd see you here," he said in a voice that sent a shiver down my spine. I swallowed hard, my instincts screaming at me to leave, but I was trapped. This was the only place I could hide. And for reasons I couldn't explain, I had the sinking feeling that my escape had just become something much worse. He stood up, a slow, deliberate movement, and I instinctively took a step back. The man's gaze never wavered, his smile widening as he took in the fear in my eyes. "Don't you remember?" he asked, his voice soft, almost coaxing. "We've met before." The door slammed shut behind me. And that's when I knew, this was no coincidence. I forced myself to steady my breath, trying to convince myself it was just a misunderstanding. Maybe it was someone who looked like me. The paranoia was starting to sink in. But this man, he knew something I didn't. "Who the hell are you?" My voice came out rough, more desperate than I intended. The man tilted his head to the side, as if considering the question. His lips twitched into a half-smile, but there was nothing comforting about it. It was the kind of smile someone gives when they know something you don't, and they're enjoying every second of your confusion. "You don't remember, do you?" He took a step toward me, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You were there. The night it all began. You can't escape, no matter how far you run. The night you made your choice." I took another step back, my pulse racing, but the back of my legs hit the bed. I was trapped. Panic set in, crawling up my throat. "I don't know you," I repeated, my voice faltering. "I don't know what you're talking about." The man shook his head, a small chuckle escaping his lips. "You think you can hide, but you can't even hide from yourself." He stepped closer still, his presence suffocating the already claustrophobic room. "You've been running for so long, haven't you? Thinking you can outrun the past, thinking you can leave it all behind. But I'm here to remind you, it's never over. The words hit me like a punch. I tried to swallow the lump in my throat, but the taste of bile rose instead. This man was terrifying, yes, but what scared me more was the seed of recognition he planted in my mind. He wasn't just some random stranger. He was a part of my past, something darker that I had pushed away. The memories flooded in like a tidal wave. The night I had fled. The blood. The screaming. The decision I made that had spiraled into something irreversible. I'd killed someone, I knew that now, but I couldn't remember the details. It was all a blur, my mind blocking it out as a survival mechanism. "Stop," I said, my voice shaking. "Please." "I didn't. You didn't want to remember." The man's voice cut through me like ice. "You think I'll just let you forget? You're in this now. You made your choice. And there's no going back." I backed away from him, but he closed the gap, his long, shadowed figure looming over me. My hand found the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. I tried again. Nothing. My breath quickened, desperation creeping into my chest. "Why are you doing this?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "What do you want from me?" The man took another step closer, his cold breath brushing against my face. "I don't want anything. I'm just the one who has to make sure you remember. Because someone has to. Someone always does." I could feel the panic rising in my throat, my chest tightening. "No," I said, my voice breaking. "Please, I can't. I can't deal with this. Please. Remember," he whispered. "Remember what you did. Remember what happens when you run. You thought you could start over, but this is your punishment. You'll always see me. You'll always hear me." I tried to push past him, but his hand shot out and grabbed my wrist. His grip was like iron, unyielding, and his gaze held me in place, making my skin crawl. I pulled against him, but I couldn't escape. Then I heard it, faint at first, but unmistakable. The soft thud of footsteps in the hallway. Slow. Measured. Like they were waiting for the right moment. The man smiled again. "They're coming for you. But they won't save you. Not this time." "Who?" My voice trembled, my breath coming in short gasps. "Who's coming?" "You'll see soon enough," he said softly, his tone almost pitying. "But you're already here, and it's too late." I turned toward the door again, but it slammed shut on its own. The walls of the room seemed to close in, suffocating me, the air thick with the weight of my guilt. The man didn't move. He just stood there, watching, waiting. And then it hit me, he wasn't just some stranger. He was a ghost of my past, a reminder that no matter how far I ran, I'd never be able to escape what I'd done. The past was here, and it had found me. The footsteps outside the door grew louder, and my heart seemed to stop. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I was trapped in a room with a man I had never consciously met, but who I knew now, deep in my bones, would never leave. The door finally creaked open, and a cold gust of wind rushed in, carrying with it the sound of more footsteps. I knew I was out of time. The man stepped back, his grin widening as his eyes flickered to the doorway. "There they are," he said, his voice a low murmur. "Your past is here. You can't run anymore." I turned, my body trembling as I braced myself for what was about to come. But as the door swung wider, revealing the dark hallway beyond, I understood something far worse than I'd imagined. There were no cops. No figures in uniforms. Only shadows. My shadows, the faces of everyone I had left behind, the people I had hurt. The room was suddenly full of them. Their eyes, hollow and accusatory, stared back at me. The man's voice echoed in the air as the shadows closed in. They've all come to collect. Just like you knew they would. The darkness swallowed me whole. And I knew, then, that there would be no escape. I didn't know what to do anymore. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him, his face, his voice, the suffocating weight of his obsession. I had tried everything, changing my number, moving to a new city, even staying with friends. But no matter what I did, he always found me. I had become a ghost in my own life, trapped in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. I couldn't remember the last time I had truly felt safe. My life had become a series of locked doors, tinted windows, and silent prayers. I was always looking over my shoulder, never allowing myself to believe that I could ever truly be alone. But then, as if by some cruel twist of fate, I found out about the motel, hidden away, off the beaten path. A place so isolated, so out of reach, no one would ever think to look for me there. A place where I could breathe again, just for a little while. I packed my things in haste, leaving behind the echoes of the life I once knew. I told myself I wasn't running away anymore, but rather seeking the only sanctuary that might offer me peace. With the weight of exhaustion and dread gnawing at my spirit, I drove through the night, hoping that this time, I could escape. The road stretched on forever, the headlights of my car slicing through the darkness like a knife. The air outside was thick with the promise of a storm, and each mile brought me further away from the city. The farther I went, the more the world seemed to fade into obscurity. Trees blurred into dark shadows, the horizon swallowed by the endless night. It was quiet. Too quiet. I thought if I kept driving long enough, I could outrun the fear, the memories, the torment. But the farther I went, the more I realized, no matter how far I ran, it would always be there. His presence. That nagging, bone-deep certainty that I was never truly alone. I arrived at the motel just as the first raindrops began to fall, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and ozone. The flickering neon vacancy sign bathed the small building in a sickly green glow. It was run down, paint peeling from the walls, a sagging roof, windows cracked and stained, but to me, it looked like a haven. My haven. I parked, my hands trembling as I shut off the engine. I stared at the sign for a moment, the promise of anonymity luring me in. For the first time in months, I felt a flicker of hope. The building seemed empty, silent, abandoned even. There was no one else around, no signs of life. I stepped out of the car, the gravel crunching beneath my shoes. My breath was shallow, my pulse quick. I needed this, desperately. I pushed through the heavy door of the office, and a bell above it jingled softly. The man behind the counter didn't speak at first. He just looked up, his eyes dark and unreadable. His pale skin, thin and leathery, made him look older than his years. His gaze lingered too long, unsettling me, but I forced myself to ignore it. "I need a room for the night," I said, my voice barely a whisper. The man nodded slowly, as if everything about this was normal. He handed me a key, its metal cold and heavy in my palm. "Room 6, he said, his voice low and raspy. I didn't ask any questions. I just nodded and took the key, retreating from the office as quickly as I could. The room was small, smaller than I had expected, but it was a room. It had a bed. A bed that didn't reek of stale cigarette smoke or sweat. It had a bathroom, a tiny window that opened into the dense woods surrounding the motel. I locked the door and pushed the blinds shut, making sure to bolt them too. The quiet outside was deafening, a stillness that pressed in on me from all sides. For a moment, I let myself sit on the edge of the bed and breathe. Maybe I could sleep, maybe I could finally let myself rest. I set my bag down beside me, my hands shaking. As I pulled my phone from my purse, I was struck by how utterly alone I felt. There was no one to call, no one to share my thoughts with. I tried texting my best friend, but the message didn't send. I checked the signal, nothing. With a sigh, I put the phone aside, trying to fight the gnawing unease creeping up my spine. I needed to sleep. But then I noticed it. A faint scratch on the mirror above the sink, barely visible but enough to send my pulse into overdrive. Asterisk, I'm always with you. Asterisk. The words were carved into the surface, the edges jagged and uneven as if etched by a sharp object. I ran my fingers over the words, expecting to feel the coolness of the etching beneath my skin. But the mirror was smooth. Unbroken. I backed away slowly, my mind reeling. No. This couldn't be real. It must have been someone else, someone before me. I was imagining things. I stepped away, my heart racing. But then I looked at the bed, and I saw another message, carved into the wooden frame. Asterisk, you can't escape. Asterisk. My pulse spiked, my breath catching in my throat. This was impossible. I must have imagined it. I glanced back at the mirror, and this time, the words seemed more defined, almost as if they were still being written. I ran my hand over the bed frame, my fingers trembling. My heart hammered in my chest as I backed into the corner of the room, my legs weak. The walls seemed to press in on me, narrowing the space until I felt like I couldn't breathe. I had to get out. I needed to leave before it was too late. But there was nowhere to go. The window wouldn't open far enough for me to escape, and the door was locked. I fumbled for my phone, hoping for some signal, some sign of life outside this room. But the screen remained black, unresponsive. There was no way out. The air in the room grew thick, almost suffocating. I could feel his presence. It wasn't just in the messages, no, it was something deeper. Something far more sinister. I couldn't escape him. Not now. Not ever. I heard the creak of floorboards, slow, deliberate steps coming from outside the door. I turned toward the sound, my heart threatening to burst from my chest. I pressed myself into the corner, trying to hide, to shrink into nothingness. The door rattled, and then it opened. I couldn't breathe. Couldn't move. A shadow moved across the threshold, tall and unmistakably familiar. My stomach dropped. The figure stepped forward, just out of reach, but it didn't matter. I could feel his breath on my skin, hear his voice in the back of my mind, that cruel whisper. Asterisk, you thought you could escape, didn't you? Asterisk. I wanted to scream, but my voice wouldn't come. His hand stretched toward me, the coldness of it reaching through the air. Asterisk, you should have known. You can never outrun me. Asterisk. I scrambled backward, but there was nowhere to go. The walls were closing in. The messages on the walls, on the mirror, on the bed, they all bled together. Asterisk, I never left. Asterisk, asterisk, you're mine. Asterisk, asterisk, you're mine. Asterisk. I pressed my hands to my ears, but it didn't stop the words from swirling around me. I looked up at the mirror one last time. And I saw him. The man from my nightmares, standing behind me, his face a twisted mask of pleasure. His cold fingers slid across my neck, and in that moment, I knew I had never escaped. Nowhere was safe. The days that followed were a blur, trapped in a haze of terror and disbelief. When they found my body, there were no signs of struggle, no marks on the door, no indication that anyone had entered the room. Yet, when the investigators looked closely, they found something chilling. On the mirror, where I had once seen the words carved into the glass, now lay a new message, one that had appeared after my death. Asterisk, you were always meant to be mine. Asterisk. No one could explain it. They said it was a trick of the mind, a final break from reality. But those who knew me, those who cared, could never shake the feeling that the motel had been more than just a place of refuge. It had been a trap, a dark, malevolent force that had been waiting for me all along. And somewhere, in the silence of that remote motel, my stalker still waits. He's never truly gone.